What really distinguishes Canada from the United States culturally? One of the biggest cultural differences I've observed is that Canadians are a bit more British in their mindset, in that they're predisposed to following rules and they largely trust the government. Unlike Americans, who are much more distrustful of authority. The U.S. was founded on the principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Canada was founded on peace, order, and good government. Canadians also have that British passive-aggressive, non-confrontational streak to them, especially when it comes to social norms like being polite, queuing, not being excessively loud and swearing in public, etc. Well, demographically they have a lot less black people and even less Latinos. Also, there's Quebec, where French is spoken and is just different from the rest of Canada due to the heavy French influence. I live in Detroit and hop across the border regularly for work. It is pretty similar, but even in Windsor you can find differences. Like Caesars instead of Bloody Marys. There are different stores. And even in Windsor you get the stereotypical Ontario accent. They're a lot more casual and familiar with people than we are in Detroit. Everything also feels ever so slightly European, from the architecture to the way they advertise. I noticed that people of color in Canada somehow culturally are less distinct from the white people. They only look different but act and speak the same way. In the USA, a very large portion of the black community is culturally very different from the white. They speak and act differently. When a black person speaks without slang and uses neologisms, they can even be accused by their community of acting white. Same with the choice of music, clothes, etc. You can tell in the US black people have really been segregated for a long enough time to have a separate cultural identity. I've dated several Canadians and now I'm married to one who was originally from Germany. And I've even lived in Ontario unofficially for a period of time. My opinion is that even though they will deny it, except for the Quebecois and maybe the Maritimes, Canadians and Canada are more similar to the US in general than even certain parts of the US are to each other. I grew up and have spent the majority of my life in the US in the northern half. Canada is more familiar to me than most of the southern US. Probably love for hockey. It's definitely there in the US, but not nearly as much as Canada. Fun fact: 90% of Canadian population live within 100 kilometers of the US border. We have stipulations like requiring a certain amount of content played on air to be Canadian, so to not lose culture or assimilate with America. Edit. Apparently it's 100 miles, not kilometers. The English monarchy mostly. Really, a Minnesotan or Wisconsinite has more culturally in common with a Canadian than they do with a Texan or a Floridian. So this is a little more complex than US versus Canada. I'm in Vancouver. When I went down into Washington, yes, even a lib state like Washington, I noticed tons of bumper stickers, signs and doormats for sale, keychains, mugs, billboards, commercials, etc. that are just beyond illegal in Canada. It's all very political and divisive. Just an example, the Bass Pro Shops in Canada isn't allowed to sell "In This House We Love Jesus," have guns, and two genders, or whatever. I took a picture of one of these doormats for sale if anyone needs proof. The food portions are also bigger and less healthy. The obesity rate definitely makes sense there. WTF is breakfast syrup. My Hampton Inn didn't have maple syrup for waffles, just caramel-flavored corn syrup. Americans tend to have more of grasp of Spanish language and grammar. I've heard Canadians say things like hombre with the H and señor as senior. This is probably due to proximity to Latinos in daily life. It's weird how little Americans think about Canada even though we share the longest border in the world. I'm only 4 hours from Canada and I feel like it should impact my life more than it does. You have bagged milk, we are not the same. Tim Hortons, poutine, and non-trivial likelihood of seeing a moose. You, Canada, are like a really nice apartment over a meth lab. Robin Williams. Canadian identity is largely, we're not America. That is a little like asking, what is the difference between a European and an Asian? In Turkey? Not much. Comparing Scotland to India? A lot. Compare a Torontonian from a Michigander and you won't see much difference. Compare a Louisianan to a Labradorian and you'll see a big difference. The main differences are, indeed, political. There are some pretty significant differences in political culture between English Canada and the US. But that's not your question. I'll try to avoid politics, but everything is political in life. In the end, there are a handful of brands, pop culture references and foods that Canadians are familiar with and use as signifiers to mark them as different from the US. It's pretty shallow, but it matters to people. Canada has a major public broadcaster called the CBC that reaches every region on TV and radio. Canadian broadcasters are required to include a certain amount of Canadian content in their programming. Leaving aside the political aspect of that, it means Canadians, at least those old enough to have watched TV as it aired, have certain programs they are probably familiar with that Americans aren't. That serve as further signifiers. It also means we all know AMD listen to Canadian band and artists. Race and racism looks different here. In the US, the single largest minority group are African Americans descended from enslaved people. Slavery wasn't a major part of Canadian history, so that demographic is much smaller. There are very few Latin people as well. The largest minority in Canada is Indigenous people, so concerns about issues surrounding them loom much larger in our consciousness. You are a lot more likely to hear racist comments and scapegoating directed at First Nations than Black people. And attempts at creating inclusive places tend to turn toward Indigenous culture first. Older generations remember Canada being part of the British Empire, and likely have positive feelings about the Commonwealth, the UK, and the monarchy. Younger people, not so much. Canadians do enjoy the big three team sports of the US: baseball, football, basketball, but hockey is bigger than anything else here. Some people like curling. There's some small dialectical differences in the way we speak. Cot and cot sound exactly the same in a Canadian accent. And we have something called Canadian raising. All of the above refers only to English Canada. Of course, Quebec's culture is very unique to itself. I live in a border state, and years ago when I worked in retail we would get literal busloads of Canadians in town to shop. They loved Target. And I could tell the store was full of Canadians during the day because it looked like a bomb went off. Not sure what the etiquette was in Canada at the time as far as shopping goes, but they would just throw things everywhere. I would find clothes draped over signs, packages of underwear piled on fixture bases, clothes strewn over racks. It was an unusual mess compared to the wear and tear of everyday shoppers. It was also a known thing and we would all joke about it. And we loved waiting on them because they couldn't be nicer. But also so messy. They also call shopping carts buggies. Those were the big differences I've noticed. Otherwise, they are basically Minnesotans. One thing to consider also. Back during British rule, Canadians chose the path of diplomacy while America chose the path of separation, war from British rule. I see this as a catalyst for the future of the two cultures and how they ultimately developed to what we see today. I mean, we do have our own unique regional cultures like anywhere. We have our own versions of English and French accents. We have our own history, music, celebrities, form of government, money, etc. Is that not enough to be considered a separate culture and country for you? If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Ercoooll is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.